In this presentation, we will be discussing an integrated learning sequence for a Year 1 English lesson, which will have links to other parts of the curriculum and embedded with the Indigenous cross-curriculum priority. The purpose of this sequence is to investigate a Dreamtime story and narrative and identify the key features being the plot, characters, and setting. The students will be introduced to Aboriginal artwork elements such as dot painting and Aboriginal colour themes, for which they will then use to create their own artwork, which will be featured in their own storybook retell of the Dreamtime story, How the Birds Got Their Colours. This presentation aims to show how my lesson sequence was developed in alignment with the professional practices expected by teachers in Australia, known as the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers, in particular 1.4, from the Know Your Students and How They Learn sector. It discusses strategies for teaching both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, and how you must demonstrate a broad knowledge and understanding of the impact of the culture and the cultural identity of these peoples. As discussed, this is done through the Dreamtime story, which are extremely important stories in Indigenous communities and for their people. According to the Department of Education, Dreamtime stories play an important part in cultural heritage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples because Indigenous values, responsibilities, and spiritual beliefs are woven into the stories, which will be discussed throughout the lesson sequence. The lessons have been developed specifically to link to a wide range of curriculum KLAs, from science, the arts, and language, in particular Indigenous language. Each inclusion plays an important role not only to the lesson, but they have strong links to the Indigenous cross-curriculum priorities that are associated with them. This has been done through the 8 Ways of Learning framework. Now, it should be noted that these lessons have been developed with the core teaching pedagogy that is used frequently in North Queensland, being the gradual release of responsibility. However, this has also been done with association of the 8 Ways for Learning framework. The framework itself helps to easily incorporate Indigenous perspectives using Aboriginal learning techniques, where each lesson will feature elements of the framework to successfully embed these Indigenous perspectives into the lesson. Within this lesson sequence, 6 of the 8 Ways of Learning have been included in the lesson sequence. They include story sharing, community links, symbols and images, land links, deconstruct/reconstruct, and nonlinear. Examples of this are where we are sharing the Dreamtime story, which is, as been discussed, very important stories in Indigenous communities. We will be introducing them to symbols and images that are important when representing parts of the land or parts of animals. And we will also be making land links, where when we are analysing the story, we'll be looking at how they have created parts of the land, which again will be emphasising the symbols and images. Now, it should be noted that we will discuss that part of the 4th lesson would be improved if we could get an Indigenous elder for the Walkarooka community, but we will discuss that later on. The first lesson in the lesson sequence will introduce the Dreamtime story to the students. Throughout the lesson, the teacher will propose specific questions about the key elements of a narrative, being the plot, setting, and characters. But the teacher will also use the story to discuss the important values that are embedded throughout. As we've discussed, the Dreamtime stories often embed core values of those communities. Half of the 8 Ways of Learning framework have been included within the first lesson. The storybook will have land links and includes important symbols and images that are of meaning to the Aboriginal people that have created this story. The learning that will be done through the story sharing will also underpin the core value of the story, which is the importance of caring for people. This is an extremely important value in Indigenous communities, as they emphasise the importance of being respectful to not only members of the community, but also the environment. As we continue through the lesson sequence, we will discuss how the story's plot is developed. This will give students a chance to discuss what happens in each part of the story. Through a yarning circle, students will be able to share their thoughts on the elements of the story, like how maybe the dove felt when it hurt its foot. The teacher has the ability to then link this to real-life situations, and they may ask the students that perhaps when they see someone who is injured, maybe they should be like the parrot and go over and ensure that that person is okay, rather than wandering around far away like the crow, because as we see, the reward is not so good for the crow at the end of the story. This lesson will feature a differentiated lesson assessment, with the lower students receiving a cut and paste activity with the writing of each page still present. This scaffolding allows these students to still be able to participate in the lesson and recreate the plot sequence, which they will have to do as we continue through this lesson sequence. But the students who are at standard and above standard, that the teacher identifies that they will be able to recount the story correctly, they will be able to develop their skills when the cut and paste has no writing on each of the page, where they will have to infer what is happening and then remember where that belongs in the story. The deconstruct-reconstruct element of the 8 Ways of Learning framework is embedded into the third lesson, where students are taking the whole story and breaking it down into each part. They will be creating a story sequence during their activity, which will include all the key vocabulary and include a specific drawing relating to that page. This is where students will also be applying their interpretation skills, where they will see the worksheet that has a particular number of pages. So they will have to be specific about what is the important information at each stage of the plot that has to be included, and which relevant pictures should be included into their drawing. The fourth lesson features the most Indigenous inclusion, where students will be creating artwork for each of the parts of the narrative sequence. This art will be done using elements of Aboriginal art, which will be introduced at the beginning of the lesson. The 8 Ways framework appears heavily to embed this lesson, which will include symbols and images, which will be appropriately introduced to students. They will learn about the important colours, symbols, and patterns that the Aboriginal people use and how they represent meaning. This allows students to gain a deeper understanding into the Aboriginal culture. It should be noted that if possible, this is where the inclusion of a local Wookaruka elder of whom understands the Aboriginal art would be exemplary, as they can bring pieces of art to show students to deeper immerse them in the content. This would in turn introduce community links into the lesson, as you are getting members of the local community who are more experienced in Aboriginal art who can come in and appropriately educate these students in a culturally appreciative way. The last lesson features a number of elements of the 8 Ways framework, where students are using the artwork that was developed in the previous lesson to create their storybook retell. This is where they are combining all elements of their knowledge of narratives, their knowledge of the Dreamtime story itself, and their inclusion of Aboriginal art. This not only shows that the 1.4 standard for professional students is being met, but also shows how this lesson sequence has suitably embedded Indigenous elements and perspective to prosper positive learning in English. Students can use this newfound knowledge of symbols and images, as well as the storytelling that they have learned, to apply to future learning. On top of that, the strong values that are associated with the Indigenous storytelling will hopefully be instilled in the young students in the classroom, with the concept of being caring of others, as I've already mentioned, being one of the strongest Indigenous perspectives that exist within communities.